I'm going to present you with a few graphs, and I want you to interpret these graphs. I want you to tell me what's going on here, okay? So the first set of data that I want you to interpret, okay, I have here something called the NatSal3. Now, effectively, for those of you that don't know, the NatSal is a collection of data that actually started in the 1980s. Okay? And it basically asks people about their sexual health and about their sexual interaction, their sexual partners and things like that. And the reason why is because in the 1980s there was a sort of a sexual health crisis because the spread of the AIDS virus or the spread of the AIDS disease went around. Okay? And basically the government wanted to understand how people were kind of interacting with each other, how they were having sex with each other. They want to understand people's attitudes towards sex so they could understand the spread of the AIDS virus, okay? So this has been going on for several years. This is the third one that took place. There was one that took place in the 1980s, one that took place at the end of the 1990s, and this one took place, I think, around 2015, okay? So it was about 5 years old. Now, interestingly enough, this data is actually stored at the University of Essex. Okay, so it's national data and it's stored at the University of Essex in Essex Labs. Okay, so as part of the thing which took place in the sort of 1990s, we basically sort of argued that data should be stored properly, and we offered to store a lot of national data sets here. Okay, so at the University of Essex, this data is stored. So anyway, this is a presentation of some of the data. So this is real life data, okay? You can see here the way that data has been presented, okay? So you can see, for example, that we are representing an average, okay? So you've got mean, median and mode. We're also interpreting spread, okay? So we've got range there, we've got interquartile range, and we've also got a measure of standard deviation. So in other words, it's a big data set. Like there's lots and lots of data in there. And this is how they've chosen to represent it. It's just giving you key statistics, which means that you don't have to look at the whole data yourself. There should be enough there for you to understand. Now, can I give you 2 minutes on your table? And can you draw what you think the distribution of the data would look like for the men and for the women? Okay, so I've given you the average, I've given you the range, I've given you interquartile range, and I've given you standard deviation. What I want you to do is draw the distribution, just by hand, of what you think this data should look like. Okay, so 2 minutes.
Is it 2 tables or 1?
You can do it as 2 or you can do it as 1, it doesn't matter. I do it as 2, men and women. By the way, when we represent data like this, so we're just representing the key results, the average and the measures of spread, we call this a summary table. Okay, a summary table. Good question. So along the bottom here, I would have age. Okay. So would I have age? No, I wouldn't do that actually. Okay, so have a look. You've got here reported number of opposite sex sexual partners in a lifetime. So along here, you're going to have the number of sexual partners. Along here, you're going to have frequency. So hopefully I've given you enough time to think about what the distribution would look like for each of the men and the women. Okay. So hopefully you have constructed a graph that looks something like this. Okay, something like this. Doesn't have to look exactly the same. I've just chosen to put the men and the women on the same graph, but hopefully you constructed something like that. It could have been a curve, it could have been a dot plot. Remember, I don't care how you represent it, as long as you represent something along these lines. Along the bottom, you've got the reported number of lifetime sexual partners. Okay. And along the sort of y-axis, you've got the percentage. Okay, you've got proportion. So the number, if you like, of sexual partners, the number of people that said they had this many sexual partners. Does that make sense? Did you have something that looks like that? Yeah? So you can see, for example, that the most common are down here. Okay? So if you go back to the previous slide, we said the mean and the median and the mode, so the averages, was going to be somewhere around the 10 mark. Okay, so if we look at that, you can see it's somewhere around the 10 mark. So in this, the majority of data is occurring down here. Okay?
Is it a range 0 to 50 or 500?
Right, good question. So you see the range says it's going from 0 to 500 or 550. Okay? Now I've just chosen to kind of cut the data off, okay, at 50. Because actually the data, this is the real life data, this is what the data actually looks like, there were just only a few which were like more than 50. So I've just kind of cut it off there, I've just chosen to do that. You remember that thing which I did with the hospital deaths, yeah? If I kind of make my range, if I sort of control the range of my data, I can tell different stories. So the thing is, if I had that scale going from 0 right the way up to 500, are you happy that I wouldn't be able to tell the story which is happening down here? Yeah? So that's the reason why I've just chosen to cut it off. Okay? But first of all, just looking at this summary data table, you might have noticed something a little bit awry here. Okay? You can assume that there were lots and lots of people that were asked. And there were. There were lots and lots of people that were asked. Now, this table is talking about opposite sex. So men and women. We're not talking about same sex, we're talking about opposite sex, so men and women. Do you notice anything strange about this table? Sorry? Mm-hmm. What about it?
It should be the same.
Good. It should be the same, right? So in other words, the data for the men should be exactly the same as the data for the women, shouldn't it? Because it's talking about opposite sex, and there were enough people being asked to represent what was happening at the population. So sure, it might not be exactly the same, but it should be pretty much the same, right? Now have a look, for example, at the mean, okay, the mean, which was higher, the men or the women? It's the men, right? And not just a little bit higher, it's massively higher, like 14 compared to 8 or 9. Does that make sense? So what can we already start to infer? Well, they could be lying, or the women could be lying as well. But yeah, men typically say, yeah, I've slept with loads of people, whereas women are much more conservative, all right? So what else can we notice from this? What else do we notice? Think about what I said with mean, median and mode, right? What we were talking about last lesson, and the difficulties with sort of mean, median and mode, right? Which would be the best representative here? The mean, the median and the mode. Which one is most accurate here? The mode could be, yeah, I'd also take the median as well. The median is also okay, yeah. Which one would not be?
Mean.
Yeah, the mean. Why is the mean not a good, not a reliable test in this case? Yeah, the outliers. If somebody says, yeah, I've slept with 1,000 people, yeah, do you know the mean is going to get pushed towards that end, right? It's going to get pushed that way. So the mean in this case is not reliable, okay? Have a look as well at the standard deviation. Just remind me, what is the standard deviation again? Yep. It's the average. It's the average distance away from the mean. Yeah, so the standard deviation is the average distance away from the mean, right? So on average, everybody was within about 20, all the men within about 24 people of where the mean should be, and the women within about 19 people. Now again, that's strange because it should be exactly the same, unless men are having sex with themselves, which doesn't really make sense, right? So, well, I guess it could do, but let's not go into that, okay? Now what I'm wanting to do is have a look at this data. Okay, so this is the true distribution which is actually happening with this data. So 2015. Can I give you 5 minutes to have a look at this and tell me what it is showing? Because I think there's a lot of things that you can make from this. There's a lot of things going on from here. Okay, so maybe things that don't look quite right, or maybe just a story which you can tell here. Can I give you 5 minutes and discuss it in your groups, please? Okay, so what have we noticed? So just tell me the story which is happening here. Tell me anything you notice.
Most the population are under 10.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Skew to this side.
Perfect. Okay. So the first thing you notice, the majority of people say that they have less than 10 sexual partners. Okay. Now, what type of skew is that? So the majority of the data is down here, and the outliers are over here. What type of skew is that? Did you read the slides? Positive, because the outliers are in that table, tail, yeah? Good, excellent. So it's a positive skew. What else do you notice? Boys, what did you notice? Good. So in other words, the men tend to report they have more sexual partners than the females, than the women. Okay, and that again is coming back to the idea that men tend to be like more brash about it, more like bravo, whereas the sort of female's a bit more conservative, yeah? As if it's like a shame. And that's maybe a social thing going on as well, so that's interesting. Okay, Huijia, did you notice anything?
Men have a more outlier.
Okay, so they tend to report they have lots and lots of sexual partners. Excellent. What do we notice over here?
Basically that the numbers are more rounded up.
Good. So in other words, did you notice that? Okay, so just look at those blue bars, maybe above sort of 10 or so. Okay, so have a look. Like 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. When the numbers tend to get quite big, it tends to be that people report the round numbers. It's like, if they say, for example, slept with 32 people, it's much more likely that they would say, I've slept with 30 people. Or, say, for example, if you slept with, 47 people, it tends to be more likely that you say, I've slept with 45 people. So you report round numbers because it starts to become less significant. Now, this is interesting, and this is something to bear in mind when you're looking at data yourself, because this often happens with things like age. When you ask people, how old are you, right? If you ask like a 37-year-old, they are much more likely to say, I'm 35 or I'm 40 than say they are 37 years old, yeah? Whereas for the smaller numbers, like if you ask children, for example, that tends to be more specific, okay? So if you ask a 6-year-old, how old are you? They're very proud of it, they're 6 years old, right? Whereas when you ask people that are sort of maybe above 20 or so, they tend to round a little bit more, okay? So it's something to bear in mind. Now this calls into questionability, or calls into question, how credible is this data then? How credible is this data? And I want you to think about that. Has anybody got any thoughts? How credible is this data? I mean, clearly it's not accurate. It's not truly accurate. Because if it was accurate, we would expect the same story for the men as for the women, because we're talking about opposite sex partners, right? So clearly it's not 100% accurate. Now, how they collected this data was literally just by asking people. That's the only way to collect that data. It was just literally survey data and getting people to report the number of sexual partners that they had, among other questions. Now, because that's sensitive data, you need to think about the reliability of that. You need to think about the reliability. So whenever you're asking sensitive questions, don't expect people to be 100% accurate. And you can see that being illustrated here, right? It tends to be that men report that they have loads and loads of sexual partners, and women tend to be more conservative. And also, for data above maybe 15, 20 or so, people report round numbers much more often. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? So just be aware, when you're looking at data, think, how was the data collected? If it was survey data, if it was self-reported data, you need to question the reliability of it. Now, actually, in this case, because it was asking enough people, because it was asking a large sample size, I think it is relatively accurate. So you can tell some kind of story. But even so, at a population level, when you're asking lots and lots of people, you still get these discrepancies because people aren't being 100% accurate. Yeah? And maybe there's social pressure in there as well. Does that make sense? Yeah, so being a statistician, think how the data was being collected.